Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me today in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and, oh yeah, that sometimes messy thing that we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com. All right, Bokeh Podcast listeners, welcome back to another conversation here with the photography industry at large. And I'm here with a new friend of mine, Tallan Paul. Tallan, thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast listeners.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
And you and I were actually just chatting about this before I hit the record button. But one of the things that I'm already excited about regarding our conversation is that I want to bring the perspective of newer photographers to the industry to Bokeh, because, you know, it's easy if you listen to photography podcasts or just podcasts in general, there's a tendency to go to the celebrity or go to the person with all the experience in the world. But what I've learned, especially being a parent, actually, I have a little bit more experience in life than my kids do. But what I find is, despite their lack of experience, my kids have a wonderful perspective, and I can learn from them. And I'm not trying to compare you to a child, to be clear. But my point, very simply, is that lack of experience doesn't necessarily mean lack of wisdom. And so I'm really excited to be able to share your perspective on photography, a little bit of your journey in the photographic industry. And then we're going to talk about an interesting topic a little bit later on that I think we can all relate to in some form or fashion. That is the topic of procrastination. And so we'll get to that here in just a little bit. But to get us started, something that we normally start with at the podcast is something that I call the technique for time. And this podcast is very much focused on encouraging efficiency in the photography business for the sake of having more freedom, more flexibility in our lives. And so I'm curious if there is something that you do in your workflow regularly to create more time, more freedom for yourself.
Absolutely. And that is, I use a calendar. Always schedule out my days, and like pretty much every hour is planned out. And I use Google Calendar, and especially during the school year, I'll have my classes, my work schedules, my photo gigs. Everything's planned out, but I always dedicate specific hours to time for myself so that I can relax and enjoy and release any of that cognitive stress that's going on.
Which is really important too, especially for the sake of creativity, right? If we're kind of stuck in the noise inside our head, it's hard to be creative, whether it's creating a beautiful piece of art in the context of imagery, or to be creative in the context of maybe a new marketing campaign for our business or whatever it might be. But yeah, it's so important to create that space for ourselves so that we have clarity of mind, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And just for the sake of context too, for our listeners, you mentioned being in school. You're in college at this point?
Yeah. I'm in, let's see, this is my third year of community college.
And what's your focus? What are you studying?
My focus shift here and there, but I'm honed in on engineering.
Interesting. Okay. So there's a kind of fascinating dichotomy here between engineering and photography, right? The kind of the right brain versus the left brain conversation, the creative versus the logical. Talk to us about that dichotomy. How do they coexist for you?
Well, I've always been interested in building things, and my dad's he's in the industry, so it's in our family. But I've always loved the kind of the problem solving aspect of it,
okay, and
also the creative aspect of it, of bringing an image in my head into reality. And I think that's partly how I fell in love with photography. Is it's almost that same process, is where I have an idea and, okay, how do I make it real? How to make it tangible.
Ooh, I really like that. And I don't think I've heard that perspective on our podcast to date. I really, really love that process. So when it comes to looking at an image, I mean, whether you're seeing something, say in a magazine, I guess we don't look at magazines as much anymore, but a magazine or social media, we'll say, or in a website, or maybe TV screen or a computer screen, you're looking at an image, and then you're trying to put two and two together and figure out how to actually translate that to your camera and to the images that you're generating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's like the same thing with, how you build a fence. What materials do you need? What do you need to learn? Like, how are you supposed to drive the nails in properly? There's a lot to it.
Yeah.
And it's so satisfying to see that finished product,
Oh, it's really true, and I like that analogy as well. That's really cool. Well, the significance of a calendar has been, it's certainly not understated as of late on the podcast, but I love the consistency and the theme around this conversation, which is very simply to schedule your time proactively. It's so easy for, I mean, I've heard it so much in the photography industry, the kind of typical, cop-out answer many times, I'm busy. And the reality is we're probably, most of us are quite busy. We've got a lot of things going on in our lives. But at the end of the day, a friend of mine actually just texted me this very thing today. He said, we make time for the things that we actually prioritize that are important to us. And so in order to do that proactively, to make sure that we have space not only for our personal life, but for our business, to make sure that we're giving time to the important people in our life, but then also creating on the photographic side and doing things that are going to actually grow our business, having a little time just for some quiet for ourselves. You alluded to the importance of that. We have to be proactive and scheduling our weeks. And it's very simple. We've got a calendar built in our phone. We need to be proactive in using it. And so I appreciate you bringing that to light yet again. And speaking of free time, how do you like to spend it? What does your free time look like?
My favorite thing to do is to watch movies and to listen to podcasts and just watch YouTube videos. I love watching art. I'm not quite so into paintings as much, but I love analyzing pictures and trying to figure out, how did they film that? And that's really why I love watching it, is really, the narrative of it and the visual, stunning of it. And yeah, I like trying to figure out, it's problem solving. It's always problem solving for me. Yeah.
But I love how that then translates to something that is not necessarily logical, right? That has emotion innate to it, which is creating artwork or imagery. But I can absolutely relate to you, particularly on the movie front. I'm a little bit of a geek or a dork in this regard. I have rated close to 1,000 movies in IMDb. And that sounds ridiculous. And actually, I guess the main reason it sounds ridiculous to me is because that then means that I've spent, a good 2,000 to 3,000 hours minimum watching movies in my life. But I found a lot of, and this is something I honestly don't spend as much time doing anymore, but I found a lot of inspiration from movies, especially the visual element, as you spoke to. And in fact, one of the things that was particularly inspirational for me was the aspect or the element of backlight or rim light that I noticed was used. I mean, you can see it in a sitcom used with studio lighting, or you can see it filmed, in a beautiful outdoor scene in a movie. And I found inspiration in that. And kind of like you, it was like, okay, that looks stunning. I want to recreate that in my imagery. And how do I go about doing that? Or I learned to better see light. By seeing the light in the movies, I could kind of translate to how I was seeing light in my imagery. Do you find similar motivation?
Absolutely. And as being a photographer and learning how to use light to get the look that I want, I started noticing things like that. It's like, oh, that's backlight. Or, the light's probably at this angle. It's like, oh, that looks great to get that shadow. And yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah, well, there are, and man, I wish I could remember the names. There's a couple of movies that I can picture. I mean, speaking the visual, that I can picture right now. Maybe we can link to these in the show notes later on, that were particularly interesting to me visually, that I found a lot of inspiration in. But in general, particularly when it came to lighting, I found it was really helpful to use that as a point of reference and then try to translate to my artwork. But as far as movies are concerned, do you have a favorite? Like, are there a couple that come to mind?
Oh man, there is definitely a top 10 list. I don't know about a favorite. Like, there's some really good draws, and they're favorites on different scales too. Like favorites visually versus favorites narratively versus what I could relate to mostly. I think probably my most favorite movie right now would be The Revenant.
Oh yes, incredible.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, you're talking about a visual feast of an experience, and it kind of holds you on your seat almost the whole movie as well. It's really, really incredible. I actually had the opportunity to go up to Banff, Canada. I don't know, it's been 2 years or so ago, and fly over in a helicopter, fly over one of the scenes or the areas where they shot one of the scenes from that movie. Just a stunning experience. But yeah, absolutely, that would be one of the higher rated movies, I think, on my list as well. Is there another one that comes to mind?
Yes, but I can't remember the name of it. It was a very intriguing movie, and it had Ryan Gosling in it, and it had something to do with like a a gang affiliated thing. I don't remember the name, but what's similar to that is this. It's the samurai movie on Netflix, The Outsider. There we go. So that one was intriguing to me, and in terms of the narrative of the story. But
and you know what? I think there's something to be said too. You mentioned that word narrative, and it reminds me. I mean, especially when it comes to film, obviously the story is important, the narrative is important, but I think it's important as well for us as photographers, still photographers, to be thinking about the narrative, how we're telling the story of the day with our imagery. And so there's something to be learned from documentaries or from movies, how a story is told, and we can even translate some of those elements to our photography. I did a quick search here. The couple of movies that I was thinking about, just that from a visual perspective, that were particularly inspirational. One is called To the Wonder. Ben Affleck actually is in this particular movie, and there are if you were looking at it in the format of a book, there might be a page worth of words that are actually spoken in this movie, but it is a visual feast. It's stunning. The music is gorgeous. So you got to check that out. It's kind of, it's an outlier and a little bit unusual, but that's amazing. The other one that I was thinking about is Pride and Prejudice, the one with Keira Knightley in it. And
oh, yes.
I have to say it's not particularly an exciting movie. I mean, in fact, maybe one of the more boring movies that I've seen, but from a visual perspective, I just remember it being absolutely stunning, and it really caught my attention. And as I was, again, considering, especially composition, probably light as well. So I'll recommend those to those listening in. But let's move on. I want to hear something kind of random that most people might not know about you.
So, yes, I've been thinking about this question for a little bit, and there's actually quite a few things. What most people don't know about me is actually I've had lots of like near-death experiences, like where I would fall off of cliffs, be very close to car accidents, mountain lions, house fires. So I have a lot of crazy events like that most people don't know ever happened. So.
Seriously, I mean, I'm smiling, mouth is kind of halfway open here as I'm hearing you say these things. Okay, so you say cliffs, like multiple cliffs. Are you regularly near
multiple cliffs? Yeah.
Okay, and a mountain lion. I mean, most of us, the closest we've ever
mountain lions.
Multiple mountain lions. The closest we've ever gotten to them would be, like at a zoo, maybe. But tell us about one of those experiences.
So the first one, I was in the middle of nowhere in California. That's where I lived. We lived way out in the mountains. I was playing outside, and I just saw a mountain lion, and it was near our house, and it was near our shed, or I was near the shed. It was about 20, 30 feet away.
Wow.
And that's about the distance they can pounce.
Yes.
And I saw that it was getting ready to pounce, and I was and I ran in the shed, and I just, screamed, "Lion, there's a lion." And my dad came running out with a shotgun, and it didn't pounce. It fled, actually, and I don't know where it went, but we found paw prints of it going around our house. And so that was the first one. The next one, I was at my grandpa's house up in Port Townsend.
Okay.
And he also lives in like the middle of nowhere. He lives in the dense forest area up there, and he has a beautiful property. And I decided to sleep outside that night. And I slept in a meadow. He told me to bring a whistle, and I was like, "Nah, I don't need a whistle." He's like, "But there's mountain lions out there." And I was like, "Nah, there's no mountain lions."
Oh man.
Turns out that there definitely are mountain lions. So luckily there was a lot of moonlight that night. But while I was sleeping there, I was just in a sleeping bag, and I heard it sounded like a woman was crying, and it really freaked me out. And so I got super alert. And then a few hours later, there's the mountain lion it's checking me out, and I didn't have the whistle on me.
And so how close is it to you at this point?
It's not as close as the first one. I can definitely see it. The moonlight was pretty bright, and It was in the woods. So I'm in the valley, and across the way, it's probably maybe half a football field.
Okay.
And it's on the other side. And so I'm more in the middle, but I guess bottom middle. I'm not quite sure how to explain that.
Okay, but about 50 yards away, it's lit by moonlight. And I mean, this sounds like a scene, speaking of movies, straight from a movie. So what do you do at this point?
I pull out my knife I had, and I just was like, all right, I'm just going to wait this out.
Wow.
I waited for hours. So I didn't want to move, and I didn't want to run to the house either. The house was another football field away. Yeah, it was. I think it was just checking me out. I don't think it wanted to eat me. It probably got enough food that night.
Oh my word!
Yeah.
Mountain lions are honestly one of my favorite animals. Period. I think the way that they move and the way that they're built, they're so sleek and lean and muscular. They're just stunning to look at. But it becomes a whole different conversation when it's 20 or 30 feet or even 50 yards away. They can move so quickly. They can jump, like you said, so far, and
they can turn in midair too.
Oh yeah.
So if you like try and trick them and move right, they'll just I don't know. They use their tail or something. I don't know how they do it.
Well, I think we've all seen like a house cat do something similar, and yet these things are 300 to 500 pounds. So a little bit different proposition. That's crazy. Well, thank you for sharing one of the most interesting, I think, random stories that we've heard to date. Let's go to photography though, because I mean that is at least a good segment of what we talk about here, a good portion of what we talk about here at the Bokeh Podcast. But you have an interesting story at this stage. You're relatively new to the photo industry. You're kind of working into it. So talk a little bit about that process, a little bit about how you got into photography in the first place and what you're doing now to get into business as a photographer.
Sure. I started out in photography when I was 14. I started out as an assistant to an already established photographer, and he was actually introduced to me through my mom. He was a friend of hers. So I started just going to his shoots, portrait shoots, not weddings, but event work like photo booths and event coverage. And at first I was really just watching and learning and just helping him with whatever he needs with lighting or stuff like that. Over time, he started, talking to me as he was working, especially when we had like downtime at photo booths and stuff. And then we would start to meet outside of his actual gigs, and I would help him edit photos. He would teach me how to use his gear. He would start mentoring me, and he became a mentor, and then he became a really good friend of mine. And so I did that for about 4 years, and last year was the first year that I started doing my own work and getting my own gigs. And so now we're more of a business partner relationship where we're helping each other grow. And
cool.
If, we give each other gigs here and there if we can't accomplish them. And
what do you foresee your business? I mean, if you at some point break off and do your own thing, I mean, do you have a particular goal as far as the type of brand position you want to establish, the type of photography that you want to offer? What does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I do not have an answer for that at the moment, but there's a reason I don't. And the reason is because I know how difficult it is to change my brand position once you already establish it. So right now I'm certainly a people photographer. I love taking pictures of people.
Yeah.
That is what I like to do. But I recently got a gig doing real estate photography. And I was like, wow, this is awesome. I love doing this kind of work. And so now I'm like, man, like I'm already kind of a portrait photographer, but I could still go into real estate, and so I'm undecided a little bit at the moment.
Well, I like the point that you make though about brand position, because I still don't think that there's enough emphasis in our industry about the significance of a brand position. I mean, the reality, of course, in this day and age, and probably not so different from years past for that matter, is that the most important element of the business in most cases in the end is the individual, is the photographer, the personality behind the camera, right? But when it comes to marketing a business, it is so much easier to do so and to create distinction in someone's mind if you're able to, in really the span of about 3 seconds, with a simple phrase or a sentence, communicate what your business represents. And even more importantly, in a very specific way. Saying I'm a wedding photographer, I mean, there are plenty of people that say that on a regular basis. Saying I'm a black and white wedding photographer who only works with people who are fans of Marvel comics That's getting
very
specific. Yeah, exactly. And now, but now you know who you're going after. You know the language that you need to speak, and you can design your website and your marketing material, your Facebook ads, whatever it might be, specifically for that audience. And it makes it so much easier to create not only interesting conversation with a potential client, but then also to build that business more efficiently. So I love that we talk about this topic a lot on the podcast. I love that you make the point that once you commit to that and you associate that position with your brand, it is a bit tough to commit to it. And so I like that you're taking a little bit of time to consider. I mean, there are so many possibilities. This idea of a paradox of a choice, you could go so many different directions. At the end of the day, you do have to choose something. But I love that you're exploring that right now, and I'm sure that you'll figure out something that works best for you. You said you're a people photographer, and I have to give you major props too, because we've had the opportunity to actually chat quite a bit over time. You interviewed me for your podcast, which I want to make sure that we link to in our show notes as well. But we've had a good bit of conversation, and you're a really great conversationalist. You're an interesting person, not only as an individual, but in the way that you talk to people. You actually show genuine interest, and that will definitely translate to the experience that you give to your clients. So yeah, major props to you for that. And I want to just very quickly kind of make an aside here. You've shared a little bit of your culture and your background, your heritage with me. And I wonder if you'll share a little bit of that with our listeners and talk about how that affects your perspective as a photographer.
Well, that's one of the biggest things that shaped my personality and my interest in other people. So I recently completed my second vision quest. And a vision quest, well, it's called Amblecha.
Okay.
And that's Lakota, and it translates to crying for a vision. It translates to also many different meanings, but the main part of the ceremony is for boys to become men, right? Nowadays it's boys and girls to become men and women. And so what they do is the boys are sent out into the wilderness in complete solitude, and they fast for 4 days without food or water or shelter. And once you complete that process, you now come back into the community as a new man, as a leader, and and so I just completed my second one, and there's a lot to it.
There is a lot to it, and it's really fascinating. You and I have chatted a good bit about it. Of course, to give further context for those who aren't catching on at this point, we're talking about Tallan's Native American background. And what tribe do you come from, Tallan? Does your family come from?
I'm from Lummi Nation, and that's a Coast Salish tribe.
Okay.
But the traditions this specific tradition is Lakota with the Blackfeet altar.
Okay. And you also mentioned to me before the heritage that both your parents bring to the picture, which I found really, really interesting. Talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So what I recently found out was that on my mom's side, she is Powhatan, which is the same tribe as what everyone knows as Pocahontas.
Yeah.
Turns out I'm a descendant of Pocahontas.
Okay.
And on my dad's side, I am a descendant of Chief Sealch, and that's what Seattle, the city, is named after. That's who the person is named after.
That's
and so
amazing.
I was like, whoa,
yeah,
wow,
you've got a lot to live up to there, but that's a fascinating backstory, and I'm sure we could dig into it more. But I'm curious. Talk to us a little bit. You said that this has had a significant effect on you as a photographer, on your perspective as a photographer. You said your tendency to be a people person. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, while I was out there, I learned a lot about myself, and I specifically learned a lot about what I really don't like about myself. And I came to a realization that, really a part of what that ceremony is we call it going into the night, or it's about death.
Okay.
And so I died out there on that hill, but not in a physical sense, in a personality sense.
Sure.
And so I looked at the things I don't like about myself, and I had to let those things go and let those things die so I can become the man I am. I had to let the boy die, the one who only wants to play video games all day. I had to let that go, right?
Hey, I can relate. I'm almost 40, and I can still relate to that a little bit. But you know what I find fascinating about this, and I certainly didn't plan on getting into this, I guess, level of conversation regarding personality, but I think this is important for all of us, myself included, for our listeners, You speak to the idea of kind of dying to self, or letting that element, that side of you, those parts of you die that you don't want to be a reflection of you. And in our culture these days, it's so easy for people to say, I am, and then just fill in the blank. I am this person. I am this personality. I am this thing. And then they use that, sadly at times, as a cop-out, as kind of an excuse for their behavior, versus saying, I want to be fill in the blank. I want to be this person. And then taking the steps, kind of like you were talking about earlier, it's the idea of problem solving. I'm going to figure out what it takes to become this person. For me, it's I have a set of values that I want to live up to. And so the intelligent thing to do is to break down my life and figure out how I need to change my behavior in order to live up to that value set. And so I think you're setting a really wonderful example for all of us, in that not only in your behavior, but ultimately the philosophy that drove that behavior.
Yeah. Well, it also gave me a new sense of patience with other people, because, so when you think you, what do you think of? Do you think of hungry you? Do you think of watching TV you? Which you is the real you? What I figured is, each day the hunger gets worse. Each day the thirst gets worse. Yeah. And so I feel like on that fourth day, I was the most me I've ever been. And so when I'm like interacting with, let's say, like my mom or my dad, and they're a bit frustrated and they might be hungry or tired, that's not them, that's tired them, and it allows me to, be like, okay, this isn't really who they are. Or even with people like at weddings and stuff, the intoxication comes into play. That's not really them. Sure. That's just happy, fun wedding time, right? And
hopefully it's happy, yeah.
right. And it just gave me, a new sense of patience where I don't get as frustrated,
Empathy is the word that comes to mind there. Patience, certainly. And but when we put ourselves in the shoes of others because of our personal experience, we do set ourselves up to be more patient. And I think that's a really great perspective that you developed there. And I appreciate you sharing a little bit about that. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Let's go back to business here for a second. And I know that you've had the opportunity to delve into the photography business world a bit. And I'm curious what the toughest lesson that you've learned has been so far as a photographer.
Failure is always around the corner. That's what I've learned.
What does that mean to you? Because honestly, like at the outset, it sounds kind of pessimistic, but I know you're not a pessimistic individual. So what does that mean to you?
It means if I forget to put that on my calendar and, whoops, I'm not going to your wedding today. Take your pictures, then I'm done. And that could seriously hurt my business and my brand, and I may not get another gig again as a wedding photographer, and so it's really easy to just let things fall apart, how many things can I do to make this a lot worse? And there's a lot more than there is to make it better,
That's funny. I mean, it's funny, but it's true, right? So there are a lot of, first of all, there are a lot of moving parts in a photography business, and so there are potentially a lot of failure points. And I think on the one hand, it's a good reminder for all of us to kind of minimize the number of moving parts. I talk about this a good bit on the podcast, the idea of the importance of simplicity, which then translates to efficiency. But part of why that even matters, at least in the context of this conversation, is the fewer moving parts you have in your business, the less moving parts that can fail, right? But certainly there are multiple potential failure points, and it is absolutely important that we pay close attention to detail. Fortunately, we live in a time now and in an industry that gives us access to wonderful tools. I mean, it can be something as simple as the calendar on our phone to CRMs that enable us to be able to more effectively keep all the details intact and organized regarding our clients and the events and what they've purchased from us and what the next step and the tasks associated with that client are, and the list goes on. We have the tools at our disposal to be able to do those things. So it's important to keep to stay on top of the details. And yet again, you give us a really, really good reminder. I think that's really great. Speaking of tools, I'm curious what maybe a favorite piece of gear in your gear bag, like a camera body, a lens, an accessory of some kind. What's a favorite that comes to mind?
I think the favorite is it's the Pro Clip by Peak Design. And I love that thing. I can put it on any camera and it'll fit on my Manfrotto tripod. It'll fit on the Pro Clip I have. I can clip it onto my chest, my belt, my wherever. That's probably my favorite tool to utilize during photo shoots and stuff like that.
And you said Pro Clip. So what are you actually clipping onto things?
So it's like the plate that you put on, like the base plate that you use to mount your camera onto a tripod. It's like that.
Okay.
But it comes with an extra accessory where it's a clip that you can put on your belt, or you can put on, like, let's say your backpack arm, or you can get creative with it too. And your camera can clip onto it like a base plate, and it'll just sit right there. It holds, I forget how many pounds of weight.
This is really good, and I actually used to use something very similar, also I think made by Manfrotto, that was a clip, and a very heavy one at that, very, very strong and very large, so you could mount it to a variety of surfaces. It also had rubber feet on it, so you could actually set it down. You didn't have to clip it onto anything. You could just set it on a surface, and it would stay put quite well. But it had a cold shoe on top, so I could put a wireless light, like a radio slave, on that cold shoe. And especially like at a reception, for example, if I wanted an off-camera light, I could mount that to, or even just sit it on top of the DJ's speaker that they had sitting at the corner of the dance floor.
Oh, nice.
And so now I had a 45-degree angle off-camera light that worked really, really well to photograph the dance with. But this is really great. We'll make sure to link to this in the show notes, because on a very practical level, I think this could be helpful to any and everyone. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes for sure. And by the way, for those of you listening in, if you don't check out the show notes, make sure you go check them out. I mean, Haley, who kind of oversees our digital marketing and edits our podcast for us, she's got a lot on her plate, but she has just done a beautiful job of putting together the notes associated with and the resources associated with all these conversations here at the Bokeh Podcast. Go to Bokeh, bokehpodcast.com, and you can see the show notes from this episode today and from all of the many of the recent episodes as well. There's a lot of detailed information, resources, links, etc. So make sure you go check that out. So let's move on to kind of our focus for today, and I want to respect your time too, Tallan. But let's talk about, and it's actually, speaking of time, not so ironically, the topic of procrastination. And when you and I chatted about, hey, what might we have a conversation about on the podcast, you brought up this topic of procrastination, and I found it interesting. And it's especially relevant to the podcast because we talk about the idea of efficiency all the time. I think most, any and everyone, certainly myself, I'll raise both my hands, literally, can relate to this idea of procrastination for one way or another. But where do you think, first of all, just this tendency comes from, especially as photography business owners?
I think it comes from your personality type. Specifically, one of the big five models, or one of the big five facets, is trait conscientiousness. I think that's probably where it comes from. I'm not sure of any scientific studies on this. I'm also no expert, but
so you said, did you say trait conscientiousness?
Yeah.
Okay. What does that mean? Can you break it down a little bit for us?
Yeah. Trait conscientiousness is, well, it breaks into orderliness and industriousness and discipline. And so these are just character describers or descriptors of people. So when you think of someone who is disciplined and, on time, efficient, that's someone who is generally described as conscientious.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Which is something that hopefully we all exhibit, at least at some point in time, but then it's also easy to put something off. I know personally, a tendency that I have is something that I'm, I guess fearful of sounds a little bit dramatic, but something that I don't want to face or confront. I'll tend to put that thing off and go to the easier task, or go to the thing that I enjoy doing more than that thing that in many cases needs to be done right away. And of course, the irony of it, I remember this was the case when I had my photography business and I'd file sales tax. I was not a fan of filing sales tax, very simply. And it would be one of those things that I kind of put off to the last minute. I knew that the 20th was coming up and I'd have to file by then. And I'd put it off to the 18th and 19th, maybe even on the 20th, on the day that I have to file. And then I'd go to file it. and I'm putting this thing off because I don't want to deal with it. And the beautiful or ironic, or I guess the beautiful irony ultimately, or the hilarious irony, was that when I actually did it, it only took 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And had I just done it a week before, 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before, I could have been done with it. I wouldn't have had to take up the mental space with it. And there was really no reason to be putting it off to make such a big deal about it. And it sounds ridiculous, but I'm sure we can all relate in one form or another. We'll put off kind of crazy things. But what is something that, I guess, how has this exhibited itself in your life? Where do you tend to procrastinate?
Oh man, I procrastinate with school. And
yeah.
School is also my number one priority. And so that's kind of weird for me. So I would procrastinate with, the most recent one is the scholarship application. It was like the deadline's coming up. Oh, the deadline's, it was June 1st. And so I got the email like 3 months earlier, and I just waited and waited and waited. And I don't know why. I think I was more worried about getting good grades. I think my grades were up more on priority than money. So I got straight A's though. And I did it on the day of, kind of like with when you filed your taxes.
Yep.
It turns out I did get the scholarship too. So,
congrats! That's great.
Wonderful. But I should have done it way earlier.
Well, and it's isn't it funny how we put those things off? Like, I guess ultimately we make a bigger deal of a lot of the stuff that we put off than it really is or needs to be. And and then of course we push it to the last minute. Then we add, again, the irony of the whole thing is that we add to the stress that's already there. We've created unnecessary stress by building this thing up in our head, and then on top of that, we add to the stress because now we're pushing it to the last minute, and then we have to rush to get it done.
It also didn't take that long, either,
right?
For me,
exactly. Well, let's get really practical here, and talk about maybe a few ways that we can get things. Maybe you've experienced this too. You've implemented this in your life, but what are a few ways that we can get things done more consistently and minimize that tendency to procrastinate?
The first thing I did was I analyzed my personality. I got my personality analyzed, and so I know where I fall on the Big Five model.
And when you say the Big Five model, is there a particular, like a website or something that our listeners can go to learn more about that?
I'm not sure about a specific website, but what I did is I went to Google Scholar.
Okay.
Google Scholar, I think it's .com,
yeah, maybe,
and I just Googled Big Five personality traits, and I just started reading studies on it.
Okay.
I'm not sure about any particular websites, but I just read just how it came about, what it means, why it's so accurate, and why it's so important too. Being 5-dimensional as you are, that's extremely complicated, and understanding what each of those 5 dimensions means and how to utilize it better for yourself, like being like, okay, let's see. So if you're high in conscientiousness, you're more likely to be a conservative. And so these things or if you're high in openness and low in conscientiousness, you're more likely to be a liberal. Like, these things make up your choices. And also it helps with your work environment. Like, if you're low in extroversion, you probably don't want to be working with a bunch of people all the time. You might want to work at home. Or if you're high in extroversion, you probably don't want to work at home. And so these are very important tools to help shape your life and to better fit your personality type.
Yeah, and again, major props to you for the effort and energy, the time that you've put into developing self-awareness, especially being so young. I mean, this will translate to so much positive in your life moving forward, personally, professionally. I think it's so important, and not just the effort to develop self-awareness, but what's particularly interesting, and again, I find I respect you very highly for, is your willingness to take responsibility for it. Because as we said earlier, there's a tendency for people to say, "Oh, this is who I am." They may read some type of book in the psychological realm and learn something about a personality type or personality types, and they're able to give themselves a label, and that feels good, but they kind of stop there. And the reality is, self-awareness then can lead to behavioral change. I've mentioned this book a number of times before in the podcast, and we'll link to it in the show notes, but there's a book by Tony Robbins called Reawaken the Giant Within. And it's a kind of a cheesy title, but honestly one of the most impactful books that I've read. And one of the, or a couple of the principles that he talks about in that book that have just been so extremely impactful to me. In fact, to the extent that I literally got tattoos representing each of the ideas on my arms in Japanese. One is belief, and the other is choice. And understanding that so much of what drives our so-called personality, who we are, what's at the root of that is what we believe. Or a series of beliefs. And of course, we're not talking about religion here. We're simply talking about what we believe about something. We literally exhibit the behavior of belief constantly. I believe that this microphone I'm speaking into is going to work, and so I use it. And fortunately, that belief is accurate. I go sit down on the couch because I believe it's going to hold me up. Fortunately, in most cases, it's an accurate belief. But in some cases, we also then believe something or a series of things that are not accurate, and then we experience the results of those poor beliefs. And we then have to, at this point, and this is what you're doing, and I love this about you, you're taking responsibility for the choices that you have the ability to make to change the beliefs that are driving your behavior and move in a direction that more accurately reflects who you want to be. There's a phrase in life that you hear a lot in life, which is the notion of finding yourself. And I think, at least in some ways, it's a bit of a misnomer. It suggests that we're looking. There's this kind of arbitrary idea of who Tallan is or who Nathan is, and we're going to go find that thing. As opposed to being proactive in it, which I think you're exhibiting, and deciding who you want to be and living that out, choosing to live that out. And that starts with self-awareness. So I know that was a long rant, but I love the emphasis, again, that you're putting on the significance of understanding who you are, developing a certain level of self-awareness, what your tendencies are, because that then acts as a baseline for an ability to be able to change the harmful behavioral patterns. In this case, we're talking about procrastination, putting something off. You can change the behavioral patterns that are harmful in nature. And I think it's a really powerful principle.
Well, that goes directly into the other two ways that help me with my own procrastination, which is to have goals and to really know what you want. And that's hard to find. It's not an easy thing to just know that for certain, right? Like when I was going into college, I was like, oh, I know what I want to do. I want to do that. Turns out I don't. I actually want to be an engineer, right? Took me a year to figure that out. And so having goals, figure out what you want, and planning for that, but also having, let's say, an anti-goal of where you don't want to be, and just you want to describe that exactly where you don't want to be. And I have experience with exactly where I don't want to be in terms of income, my own personality, my own feelings, my own, self-esteem, who my friends are. Because I've been in situations that were really unfortunate, and I don't ever want to go there again. So I'm running away from something, but I'm running towards something, but the thing I'm running away from is chasing me at the same time, if that makes sense. So those are the other things, because I think people, there is an emphasis on setting goals and trying to complete those goals, but there's not as much emphasis on running away from stuff, which like a mountain lion, that's important to.
Well, yeah, very clearly knowing what you don't want. But again, I love this. It starts with self-awareness. Hey, this is who. These are my tendencies, right? But this is who I want to be. So these are the changes that I need to make in my life in order to be that person. Now that I know who I want to be, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, having a really clear, what I call a big picture view, a clearly established set of values and goals that then drive that drive who you want to, not only who you want to be, but then ultimately what you want to do in business or the business model. That can then help determine how you spend your time day to day. Because it's easy just to kind of react to the experience, which is being a photography business owner, right? You got emails and phone calls and social media and text messages and images to edit. Well, hopefully you're outsourcing your images, editing of your images to photographers edit. But in all seriousness, you've got album design and accounting work and so forth. There's so much to keep up with, and it's easy just to kind of react to that, be in the business, not on working on it, not being the manager, the CEO that you should be. But a lot of that comes from not being clear about what you want personally, and then as a result, not having a very clearly established business model. And then the day-to-day existence becomes very haphazard in nature. So I'm glad that you're emphasizing the specificity, or emphasizing the importance of specificity when it comes to setting goals, not only for what you want, but what you don't want.
Right. And I think you worded that, perfectly.
Will you translate what the specificity of goals and the anti-goals, as you shared, how that then translates to kind of minimizing the tendency to procrastinate? What does that look like for you?
So let's say I am in school and I have a goal at the start of the term. I want straight A's. I want A's in all of my classes. How do I achieve that goal? Well, number one, complete all the homework. Number two, you have to complete the homework and get a good grade on the homework. And so you work it out. And I usually write like an essay or so. I love writing. Writing actually is a really good tool on how to do this. It's not just a thinking game. And so write it out, figure out all the steps, and then write about what you really don't want to happen and what will happen if, let's say, you don't do the homework. And then make a schedule, dedicate this many hours to homework, this many hours to this many hours to video games. And it helps to know yourself so that you know what you are capable of. You don't have to immediately strive for, man, I'm going to get all the homework done in 1 week. You don't have to do that to yourself because you probably won't be able to. So that's why knowing yourself is really important, because if you don't know what you're capable of, you won't set the proper goals and you won't be able to really achieve those goals either.
Well, I think there's some really practical tips, and I love the simplicity and the innocence of the example too of talking about homework, and yet it's ultimately the example that you're representing there is very practical and applicable to all of us, whether we're 50 or 15, and it's the importance of, as you said, knowing yourself. Setting very, very clear goals, both the goals and the anti-goals. This is who I want to be, where I want to be, who I don't want to be, where I don't want to be, and making them, I guess, appealing enough or exciting enough, something that actually drives emotion. And speaking of that book by Tony Robbins, Tony talks about the significance of how emotion drives behavior, emotion drives action. We want to create goals that are big enough that they get us excited, and then that will help create a certain sense of motivation that will drive what we do and help minimize the tendency to procrastinate. But to that point, and we'll close with this, you made a really interesting and a very important point in regards to not only setting goals, but specifically in regards to this idea of procrastination. That is not setting such a big goal that we become overwhelmed by it. Because the moment that we do set too big a goal, maybe something that we're not used to achieving on a regular basis, or something that frankly is just, it's a little bit much to try to accomplish in a relatively short amount of time. Our tendency, as we've talked about, is going to be to put that thing off because it seems so difficult. It feels so overwhelming. Creating smaller tasks, and we've discussed this before in the podcast, the significance of breaking bigger projects into more easily accomplished individual tasks that don't seem so overwhelming. But setting up tasks for ourselves that aren't so overwhelming will enable us to step by step get closer to reaching the bigger goals, and as a result, minimize our tendency to procrastinate and ultimately get a lot more done. So this has been a really, really practical conversation. I appreciate you sharing your perspective and also your background, your heritage is absolutely fascinating. And to get your perspective to being a newer photographer to the industry, I love that I love the proactivity and your tendency to want to learn and to grow. And I love that you're just going for it. So I can't encourage you enough to keep going for it. We'll make sure to share with our listeners your podcast. We'll link to that in the show notes. Where can they follow you online, about your website or social media?
Thank you for all of your kind words. And so you can go to my website. It's tallanpaul.com. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's just Tallan Paul. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also I think I'm on most of the social media sites, Pinterest, and whatever you use, I'm probably on it as well.
So that's Tallan, Tallan Paul. And by the way, you mentioned YouTube. You actually have your podcast in video form on your YouTube channel, right?
Yeah.
Very cool. And Tallan did interview me, and it was really fun, actually. We were talking about this before I hit the record button. It was fun to be on the other side of the interviewer's microphone, if you will. And so you can check that out. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. But Tallan, thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast today. Will you let us know what you think by leaving a review of the podcast in iTunes or maybe in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast, maybe suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My direct email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com.